different, wasn't it?
Well, Joe Meek was genuinely, certainly England's first independent record producer. It's way back in the late 1950s in England. I'm sure it's probably true in other countries. Like the whole music industry, recording industry was dominated by, well, we had 4 major record labels. There was the EMI group, which had labels like Columbia and HMV. There was Decca, a company called Decca, a company called Philips, and a company called Pi. And between them, they sort of controlled really about 90% of all the records that got into the charts of the day, and the rest being made up of American labels that were starting to gain a foothold. And there were 1 or 2 very, very tiny independent record labels, but they never made any impact on the recording charts in any way, shape or form. Curiously, Joe Meek, this is what a lot of people forget. Right? He actually worked as a recording engineer for these 4 labels. Before he branched out on his own, he'd actually recorded or helped to produce well over 1,000 commercially released recordings, many of which were massive hits. But let's just say I think he was obsessed with sound recording, and what he basically did was he was fed up of being controlled by other people and told what to do when he had his own ideas, because many people just, I think, stuck to the recording studios had actual manuals, like say for example, if you're recording a trumpet, you have to have a microphone that's 2 feet away, or if you're recording drums, you just have one microphone that's 3 feet above the drum kit and things like this. What Joe Meek began to do was say, well, no, actually, what would happen if you put a microphone actually inside the bass drum? People say, no, you can't do that. It's not allowed. But sometimes, he would do sessions which he was left in control of, and he would start to break all the rules of recording manual, to experiment with different sounds, basically.
Himself.
He wasn't a musician in the classic, say something like George Martin or Phil Spector, who were well known. They were actually good musicians in their own right. I think Joe Meek couldn't play a musical instrument, and he was notorious for the only way he could communicate musical ideas to his session musicians would be to kind of la them out, or say, I want this kind of sound, and try and demonstrate it with his voice, which I suppose to proper trained musicians must have seemed a bit laughable in some ways, but he certainly had the sound in his mind. He said he wasn't. People say he was tone deaf. That's a bit of a misnomer, in that the records he produced were perfectly in tune. So he could hear the sound with great difficulty, because he wasn't a musician himself. He was sometimes communicating his ideas. So what he did was he began to surround himself with people he could relate to, that he could communicate his ideas to, and they could then pass on the ideas. For example, he was one of the first people to employ people like Jimmy Page and Richie Blackmore on guitar, who sort of understood what he wanted to do. We had a guy called Jeff Goddard, who was a fantastic keyboard player, and actually was trained at the Royal Academy of Music, and he became like a go-between. He could listen to Joe Meek's ideas, but he could immediately translate them into things on the piano or the keyboard, which other musicians would then obviously understand a lot better. So that's what Joe Meek did. I think he had an arranger called Charles Blackwell, who became very famous in England But Joe Meek gave these fairly untried people an opportunity. They paid him back in spades. But he did have records in the charts on his very own label, which he called Triumph Records. I'm sure you may have heard of it.
Yeah.
Well, it didn't last very long because, again, Joe found himself being constrained by the people who were putting in the money, were trying to limit him to the number of blank tapes that he could buy, or I suppose it's understandable that financiers would try to control things, but he began to feel that he wasn't being constrained by people in the studio. Sorry. He wasn't constrained by people in the studio, but there were people now constraining him through money. So he left that label, try and find another financial backer. But he very cleverly he'd kept the copyright on all the recordings and the artists, which the people he was in partnership with hadn't realised. So when he quit, they were left effectively with them. They still had the rights to the label and the name of it. They didn't have any artists to record on it, because they were all signed to Joe Meek. But that's when he hit upon the idea of leasing out his master recordings to the major record labels, and they began to agree to it because he'd actually had chart success. So it really was groundbreaking. He's in the modern day and age. Somebody told me he's often referred to as the godfather of home recording. Because he really is the guy that started it all off.
Yeah.
Because say back in 1960, okay, if you were fairly wealthy, you might be able to buy yourself something like a Grundig tape recorder, which was pretty expensive. And you might be able to get to the level of, perhaps recording yourself in your own front room. But even so, there was nobody who could do what Joe Meek was doing, and actually produced studio quality master recordings, effectively from the front room of his flat, which is what effectively it was. There's nobody who had the ability to do that. I think it's only beginning to be acknowledged now that, like in 2012, there's a British music paper again called the New Musical Express, NME. It's still going, and they actually themselves awarded Joe Meek the title as the greatest record producer, and they got a lot of flack from that, saying, come on, what about George Martin, what about Rick Rubin, what about Phil Spector, what about Quincy Jones, and you can't deny these are all fantastic, monumental producers. But I think what NME said was, the thing was, of course, even something like George Martin, for example, brilliant arranger, brilliant producer, the things he did with the Beatles. But I think their argument was that even in the early days of the Beatles, I know we know he gave them their head, they gave them ideas, but as far as the recording side was, the idea was to still be recording an accurate representation as you could in the studio of the sound they made in the studio. It wasn't until, was it like Sgt. Pepper and Revolver, that they began to experiment a bit with tape loops and backwards tapes and so on. And I think John Lennon began to request things like this. And it was George Martin is now on record as having said to one or two of his assistants, John Lennon wants to do so and so. How on earth are they going to achieve that? And certainly one of his assistants had said, I remember there was a recording by Joe Meek, and and he'd done this. And I think I heard this. I think I worked out how he might have done it. So it was things like this, but although they weren't widely acknowledged at the time, but if you dig deep into some of these blogs and biographies by producers at the time, it's apparent that that tape speeding. That's certainly one of the things that Joe Meek did years before anybody else, and even creating effectively what were overdubs, which even in England a lot of the big studios weren't doing until 4-track recording. Well, Joe Meek had a method of doing that. People began to acknowledge that he was doing that years before the major studios, and direct inputting instruments so they didn't actually sound in the studio while you were recording, so he could direct input the bass and fiddle around with the sound afterwards. Close miking instruments, things like this. It's become acknowledged generally that he pioneered a lot of these techniques when nobody else would dream of doing it. There are a lot of conspiracy theories. Obviously you can't deny that the only actual witness was Joe's studio assistant. It's well documented in here. A guy called Patrick Pink, and he was initially accused of murder himself, but later cleared. The only thing is that you only have his account, the details of which have changed over the years, and even he didn't actually witness the actual shootings. What I mean is, you have to assume obviously that Joe did kill Mrs. Shenton. Whether it was a deliberate act of murder, as a coroner sort of, which is not a court of law. A coroner is not a trial, but the coroner sort of directed people to say, well, it seems that Joe Meek killed Mrs. Shenton. He may well have done, and then killed himself. That is the obvious conclusion. But again, Patrick Pink didn't actually see Joe Meek shoot Mr. Jamie. Didn't actually see Joe, actually shoot himself. Obviously, he was there for the aftermath. But the way things go now, there are conspiracy theories, but they can't be proved 100%. What is definitely true, though, is that Joe Meek was being threatened by the Cray brothers, the very notorious gangsters and murderers. That is a fact. He was being threatened by them because they wanted to take over management of a group called the Tornadoes, who were all very good-looking young guys. They've all since confirmed, that this is a later line of the group, that Joe wasn't involved sexually with them, but Reggie Cray was very keen on a couple of them, because they were scared out of their wits. Who wouldn't be? It is documented by several people that at one point Joe was beaten up by a couple of the Cray's mobsters. So, and just before Joe died, there was a young lad called Bernard Oliver, who was found dead in Suffolk. Very, very gruesome, horrible murder. There's never been any suggestion that Joe Meek was involved in his murder. Never been any suggestion of that. But it is known that he was one of the young lads that Joe had paid money to have sex with. But I think it was also known that so had the Cray brothers. And in recent years, it's come to light that there was one of the Cray brothers' notorious kind of connections. Lived very close to the place where this guy's body was found. But nothing can be proved. was there something in the craze? Did they finally turn up and were threatening to do away with Joe, and his landlady turned up, so they killed him? You know, maybe threatened the guy downstairs, if you ever say anything, you're dead. You know, it can't be proved, but there are a lot of people who suspect it, so it's a possibility. Because the other thing was, there was a very famous English politician of the day called Lord Boothby, and he was definitely mixed up in all this. And you know, it's been proven that there was a police cover-up in Parliament over a lot of things that he was involved with. So who's to say this might not have been the case with Joe Meek now? But it's never been able to be conclusively proved. I don't know, I mean, but there's no doubt Joe Meek was very depressed, and my own theory, for what it's worth, is, I mean, on the day of his death, you know, he was definitely in the throes of a complete, total mental breakdown. You know, he had the shotgun there. You know, his assistant maintains he was planning to kill himself. But I don't know. So yeah, his landlady turns up. You've got the guys in the middle of a nervous breakdown. You know, you've got a shotgun that turns out to have had a notoriously unreliable trigger action. Now, in the film, it's shown as them arguing, and you know, he's waving the shotgun around, you know, and it goes off and he kills her. I mean, that could have happened. It could have happened. Or he might have deliberately shot her. I mean, I don't know. Mrs. Shenton's death is terrible. You know, it's something that society has never tried to hide. You know, how can you? But I don't know. I think, you know, to say that for somebody who wasn't witnessed, and for somebody to say, well, he deliberately shot her. I mean, you think that can't really be proven either. You know, I don't know. There's something very suspicious about the verdict was rushed through, and not even in a proper court of law. You know, it's and you think, you know, even nowadays, a modern day jury might have to say, well, he might have deliberately murdered her, but who's to say there's a chance it could have been an accident, you know, because he was clearly out of his mind, you know, and that would have been like a verdict of manslaughter, you know, or death by misadventure. You know, but, so I don't know. Who can say for absolute certain? But you know, in terms of the day and the time, you know, he was adjudged to have deliberately murdered her and then killed himself. Which of course also is, you have to say, you know, that could have been the case.
Yeah.
But it's very interesting, you know, again, talking to people who knew Joe Meek personally, you know, a couple of whom I've become quite good friends with. And that is the one thing that they always say, you know, that Joe really loved Mr. Shenton, you know, like him, but they have their fallings out, but it's like they've always said, you know, that they're not surprised that Joe finished up dead before the age of 40, you know, because of his just completely chaotic lifestyle, you know. But nobody I've ever met who's actually knew him, they've always said, you know, that they just can't believe, you know, even all the things they knew about Joe, they couldn't believe, you know, that he would deliberately shoot Private Shenton. And they've always been very consistent on that, you know, different people, different times over the years. You know, they said they found that verdict sort of shocking. In the end, they could have believed that Joe would have, you know, gone crazy and killed himself, you know, become suicidal and depressed, but none of them had ever thought, you know, that he would deliberately murder his landlady.